On December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched an attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. In the following months, hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans were rounded up and sent to internment camps under suspicion of disloyalty to the United States. But the feelings that paved the road to internment began long before the attack. For more than 80 years, Asian immigrants were viewed as economic threats, spurring various laws that effectively banned them from the country. For those who made it to America, the lingering resentment culminated after Pearl Harbor. Motivated by vocal outcries from politicians and military officials, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, empowering the U.S. Army to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal, but no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move. This picture tells how the mass migration was accomplished. Neither the Army nor the War Relocation Authority relished the idea of taking men, women, and children from their homes, their shops, and their farms. So the military and civilian agencies alike determined to do the job as a democracy should, with real consideration for the people involved. First attention was given to the problems of sabotage and espionage. Now, here at San Francisco, for example, convoys were being made up within sight of possible Axis agents. There were more Japanese in Los Angeles than in any other area. At nearby San Pedro, houses and hotels occupied almost exclusively by Japanese were within a stone's throw of a naval air base, shipyards, oil wells. Japanese fishermen had every opportunity to watch the movement of our ships. Japanese farmers were living close to vital aircraft plants. So as a first step, all Japanese were required to move from critical areas such as these. But of course, this limited evacuation was a solution to only part of the problem. The larger problem, the uncertainty of what would happen among these people in case of a Japanese invasion, still remained. That is why the commanding general of the Western Defense Command determined that all Japanese within the coastal area should move inland. Immediately, the Army began mapping evacuation areas and for a time encouraged the Japanese to leave voluntarily. The trouble for the voluntary evacuees soon threatened in their new locations. So the program was quickly put on a planned and protected basis. Thereafter, the American citizen Japanese and Japanese aliens made their plans in accordance with Army orders. Notices were posted. All persons of Japanese descent were required to register. They gathered in their own churches and schools, and the Japanese themselves cheerfully handled the enormous paperwork involved in the migration. Civilian physicians made preliminary medical examinations. Government agencies helped in 100 ways. They helped the evacuees find tenants for their farms. They helped businessmen lease, sell, or store their property. Now, this aid was financed by the government, but quick disposal of property often involved financial sacrifice for the evacuees. Now the actual migration got underway. The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort. In small towns as well as large, up and down the coast, the moving continued. Behind them, they left shops and homes they had occupied for many years. Their fishing fleets were impounded and left under guard. Now they were taken to racetracks and fairgrounds where the Army almost overnight had built assembly centers. They lived here until new pioneer communities could be completed on federally owned lands in the interior. Santa Anita Racetrack, for example, suddenly became a community of about 17,000 persons. The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all. The residents of the new community set about developing a way of life as nearly normal as possible. They held church services, Protestant, Catholic, and Buddhist. They issued their own newspaper, organized nursery schools, and some made camouflage nets for the United States Army. Meanwhile, in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and elsewhere, quarters were being built where they would have an opportunity to work and more space in which to live. When word came that these new homes were ready, the final movement began.
At the beginning of January 1945, a second Great Migration began. Just 3 years earlier, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, a presidential order had forced 110,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. With victory in the Pacific imminent, the thousands of detained families and children were now free to go, with the government often providing no more than $25 and a one-way bus fare back to a home that had already been sold or lost as spoils of war. In Southern California, with a great number of Japanese Americans now homeless, the War Relocation Authority set up temporary barracks and trailers. But by the middle of 1946, all that remained were 2 trailer parks in Burbank and Sun Valley. Now almost forgotten, these 2 trailer parks were a refuge for an estimated 5,000 Japanese Americans from 1945 to 1956.
You know, what amazes me is, like I said, we grew up in those trailers. As small as that trailer was, the 8 of us used to sit down and have dinner together, and that was, no matter what you were doing, if it was dinner time, you went home and the 8 sat down.
In my opinion, it was Roy Murakami, because I remember him coming and says that he would like to start a co-ed club. He was my judo sensei, okay? Or his father was the top dog here, Murakami sensei. That's how we met Roy, okay? And he started when he was about 7 or 8. I started when I was 9 in judo. And after a few years, I remember him coming and says he wanted to start a co-ed club for our age, so we know how to become more gentleman-like.
Did we have things like reading of the minutes? I don't
yeah,
remember.
We had
we
all
did?
that. Yes, we
remember.
did. See, we didn't know it.
Oh, and I was asking him when we were driving here, how did we get the ridiculous name Larks? I don't remember. I'm sure I would have vetoed it if somebody said,
No.
why don't we get T-shirts that say Larks?
I remember how we got the name. Well, it was at my home. It happened to be at my house.
He wanted the name Larks.
No. It came down to many different things, and it started as the Skylarks first. We all mentioned names, and someone says that's too long, so we cut it. And it was a vote democratically, boys and girls. And since it was a co-ed thing, I wanted the originators. I remember I voted for that and all that, but the locks went out.
Habiba, baby, Habiba, baby, Habiba, baby. She's a gal for me. She got plenty of rhythm, got plenty of jive. And when we dance, I really come alive. My love for her so tender and sweet. My heart starts pounding every time we meet. My bebop baby, still in her teens, just as sweet as she can be. A bebop baby in her old blue jeans, it's a bebop baby for me. A bebop baby for me.
My fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent. Yes, the nation was then at war, struggling for its survival, and it's not for us today to pass judgment upon those who may have made mistakes while engaged in that great struggle. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake. For throughout the war, Japanese Americans in the tens of thousands remained utterly loyal to the United States. Indeed, scores of Japanese Americans volunteered for our armed forces, many stepping forward in the internment camps themselves. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up entirely of Japanese Americans, served with immense distinction to defend this nation, their nation. Yet back at home, the soldiers' families were being denied the very freedom for which so many of the soldiers themselves were laying down their lives. Congressman Norman Mineta, with us today, was 10 years old when his family was interned. In the congressman's words, my own family was sent first to Santa Anita Racetrack. We showered in the horse paddocks. Some families lived in converted stables, others in hastily thrown together barracks. We were then moved to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, where our entire family lived in one small room of a rude tar paper barrack. Like so many tens of thousands of others, the members of the Mineta family lived in those conditions not for a matter of weeks or months, but for 3 long years. The legislation that I am about to sign provides for a restitution payment to each of the 60,000 survivors, surviving Japanese Americans, of the 120,000 who were relocated or detained. Yet no payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law.